All right. Well, welcome to the
Okay,
Starbased Podcast. This is your host, Tratium, with Ouija. And what are we talking about today, Ouija?
so we're going to have a little chat about kind of DAOs and their structures. It'll be kind of like, I think, broad, but it'll be, I think, an interesting chat because at Tokmak, we're going through the process of like trying to design some sort of structure and how to run through voting processes, decision making, who gets what, and things like that. So we've been having talks about it between the captains in there and the commanders, so the founders, the engineers, the team, and the kind of inner circle-ish, those who contribute actively. And I think it's a good topic for us to touch on. I've been writing a few articles. Everyone's very interested in it. And I think it'll be for a good chat.
Excellent. Yeah. If you haven't seen it, Ouija did just post an article on Tokabase called Dow Structures. And we've been going through a couple like deep dives like this. And he's gotten one in the pipeline right now that we're working on right now, editing. We're going to have a series of posts that kind of cover various like DAO topics, and then try to follow them up with podcasts like this to kind of go deep dive into it. So what's a good starting point? Should we talk about like what are the different DAO structures, and like what tends to work and what doesn't? Because what we've seen, I think we mentioned this in the previous episodes, is that over the past couple of years, I mean really since DAOs started taking off, they the flat DAO structure that everyone is just an equal participant. There's not really a central hierarchy. There's kind of, regardless of what the kind of token distribution looks like, it can still be extremely difficult to like get proposals passed or even just in the process. And there's been kind of a negative kind of view of DAOs in the past couple months, especially I've seen on crypto Twitter, and across different forums and stuff, that DAOs are just ineffective. So like what DAO structure do you think kind of helps alleviate these kind of problems that we generally see with the lack of being able to push things forward, being able to make meaningful progress within a DAO? What's a good solution for that?
I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I think we have to notice there's differences between organizations in TradFi and organizations within crypto. So in TradFi, you'd have these three different kind of groups. You have the employees, the investors, and the customers or users, right? Within DeFi and DAOs, we have like wrapped two of these together, or maybe in some cases three. So you have the employees, which tend to be the team or the founders. And then we have the customers or users and the investors, and they're sort of wrapped up in one. And then how people go about kind of the functions of how you control the governance, they tend to wrap it up with an economic incentive. So it's like the product is bound to governance of shareholders. And that creates a really weird dynamic. We saw that happen in the kind of growing nature of VE tokens that Curve popularized. They were around before that, but Curve really made it big. And that kind of brought in these economic incentives. Now, I think what people saw is like, oh, we can draw liquidity into our protocols with all these governance tokens, right?
Yeah.
However, I think that creates other problems, these what I call second order problems, or second order effects, that I don't think people have thought through. They saw it as a quick grab to get incentives or liquidity, and it doesn't work in some cases. So there's this mismatch between governance, incentives, or the fundamental kind of properties of governance, and then the protocols themselves. So their structures may be flat, like you were saying, but it may not match well with some of the properties that they should be optimizing for that protocol. Does that make sense? So in the sense, if we break it down, we could break it down into how they're structured is in decentralization, because there are sacrifices to be made. The more decentralization you have, or the more flat your governance structure, the less able you are to adapt and move to the coming scenarios and situations that happen within DeFi and crypto, which is quite a lot, quite quick, and it requires a lot of intention, right? So I think it's a broad spectrum, and it has to be specific to the protocol. In the article I wrote that you guys are going over now, I broke it down into the different sections. So the difference between DAOs and like decentralized organizations, and then you had like autonomous actors, like Uniswap, for example, is an example of that. They have a governance token, but they don't technically need one. You know, it's like you should really be prizing the code if you can kind of outsource that. If it can be immutable, you should make it so. It's like the argument that Vitalik makes that all off-chain governance that can be off-chain should be. So that, I think, dictates on what your structure should be. I personally feel like you, these flat governance structures have their problems. Maker is in a scenario of that, and we've seen it a little bit. It does work well, but it's slow moving, it's encumbered, and that can have a negative kind of effect on the protocol when it comes to governance. If they need to make a quick decision, it may be a problem. Now, that comes with a caveat, because like with Maker, I don't know how close you are with Maker, but they have like an emergency protocol.
A break
so
glass kind of thing?
I think it's like, yeah, so like 50,000 Maker can be deposited in it. It gets burned, and then an emergency procedure is initiated. The protocol will shut down, and then the smart contract will initiate a liquidation of all the assets, or technically not a liquidation, it's just a transference of all the assets back to the depositors. So they have their fail-safes, but their governance is slow. So that's what Hasu tried to do, is like produce this hierarchy, which got really contested on their forums.
And why did it get contested? I think from what I saw, it seemed to be because it basically introduced like a more traditional corporate structure, like teams and kind of a regular hierarchy that you would expect. And I think the major downside of that in the DAO kind of world is that it opens it up to like security laws and opens it up to real life legal implications, because then that entity, that organization can be treated legally more like a real organization and be exposed to those negative knock-on effects, and be more susceptible to perhaps coercion or takeover or something like that. Is that part of it?
I would say you're right in a sense that people really think that, but they're a little bit paranoid. I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that would happen. Coercion and collusion is always going to be there. We've seen it. It's everywhere. And as for coercion resistance, there's, like I touched on the properties before, there's different levels of this that you want to satisfy if you can within protocols, especially when it comes to governance. Coercion resistance is one, secrecy is another, and privacy is another. It tends to be three in that kind of sphere. Now, you can somewhat attain privacy, right? So through pseudo-anonymous functions. So, for example, people vote on Maker through Ethereum addresses, right? And it's very hard to track down those addresses and correlate them with an individual, which makes it pseudo-anonymous. However, that's good, but privacy is almost impossible because you have the blockchain. So hard, right? It's all public. So by definition, if you have that public nature of the information, which is good in a sense, but it makes coercion resistance almost impossible to attain to a greater degree. So I think that people get really wrapped up in this stuff, but I think if you break it down, you can only achieve so many properties for each protocol, and you have to tailor it. You can't meet them all. It's just too hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think already, like, sometimes I just think how cool it is to be able to just pop into a Discord, into a project, and start just chatting with teams, and just be able to immediately start participating. And it doesn't necessarily matter if the team is more centralized. As long as they are willing to accept contributions from outside, then that organization, to me, is still considered like open. There are varying levels of decentralization where individuals can affect more immediate change just by controlling more governance power and having more kind of ability to make changes to properties or parameters or whatever is exposed through governance. But really, I think a major benefit of the DAO structure is just being able to have anyone come in and participate. And I think so many of these kind of benefits that we see, yes, there you can have as much stuff as you want on chain, but there's almost always going to be like that social layer that is going to always be like the base dependency of really anything blockchain related, because it's all social consensus at the end of the day. Bitcoin, Ethereum, everything. Doesn't matter what's on chain or off chain. It's all social consensus, because at the end of the day, individuals are the ones downloading a binary to run on their computer to run that version of a node software or Bitcoin Core or whatever, and that is an individual effort. Apart from like having like some sort of server with an auto update on to just arbitrarily run whatever the latest version is, like someone has to make a conscious decision individually to download and run something that allows these blockchains to operate. And in the same way, DAOs, no matter what's on or off chain, like someone still has to type up the code, right? Like someone's still typing code and deciding what to put on chain or off chain. And so it's all down to individual people who are creating these systems to decide what is possible. So in that respect, like the social nature of it is really the most fundamental thing. And it all comes down to the teams that are running these projects and what they are doing to make kind of the expectation of openness and stuff a reality.
I think you're right. Social consensus is one of the building blocks of everything. I think having ranges of decentralization is important. For instance, Bitcoin is not as decentralized as people think. You can put all the miners who uphold the network pretty much in one room.
Yes.
And they often are. So there's that. But I think with the teams, there are many benefits. And I think having openness for people to contribute is important. I think that the level of decentralization of those teams or that DAO is important. Within DAOs, you have this center that's like the autonomous part, the code. And that in traditional finance would be law, would be regulations. In DeFi, that part is code, hence code is law, right? But you still have these human edges around, and that's where the team is, that's where the community is. It has internal capital, which it uses to drive the incentives for those people to work and take part. That's a balancing act, and that's what makes it very different. It is a social consensus around, like a ring around the edge, and it allows you to have freedom in a way that you would not have had if it wasn't DeFi. There's no way you could take part. There's too many barriers. But yeah, like you say, anyone can walk in and contribute, and it's a really, really important thing. The communities allow for homegrown talent to be recruited, people who wouldn't have had that opportunity. It allows for collaboration on a global scale, which is really important. And I think that some protocols are better off staying like that. Some of them, over time, to become more close to the ideal of a DAO, which is technically an ideal anyway, as a trend over time towards that, they will become more and more solidified. Things will become more immutable, more autonomous, and in theory, it could become more flat, but only because you outsource it to code over time.
And
so yeah.
And that brings up an interesting question too, because in exploring some DAOs lately, some of the stuff that I know to be like very immutable, let's say, like the pseudo swap contracts that were just deployed. Deployed on chain once, and they're pretty much done. And is there a DAO around that? Like I pop into the Discord, and there's no community calls. There's nothing to discuss because the code is deployed. It's done. So on the spectrum of the most decentralized, autonomous, immutable code, like, do you need a DAO around that? Because the code is done. Like, what decisions are there to be made when the code is done? You can always build on top of it, and you can extend it, and the code is composable, extensible, then you can build on top of that and stuff. But once the core code is deployed and done for these, let's say, hyperstructures, is there even a need to have humans involved because the code is deployed and people can interact with it, and there's not really any more need for individuals to get involved?
I agree.
A slightly poor example would again be like Solidly, which was, in my opinion, horribly named, the Andre Cronje project, where he on Phantom, where with the massive caveat of if it was successful and wasn't bug-ridden when it was deployed, that was a situation where he was like, I'm going to deploy this, and then I walk away. You don't need Andre anymore because the code's done. So in situations like that, like in the ideal utopian future of blockchains where all the primitives are, let's say, perfect, deployed, immutable, then where's the room for humans? Like you have all the Legos are done being built. You no longer really need to make much changes to that, and don't really need to have a DAO around it. So ultimately, is there even like a point to the massive inefficiencies of having like a flat DAO structure if ultimately you want to build something really well, deploy it, and then be finished? So like, I guess it almost seems in some ways, and this is maybe perhaps like a devil's advocate approach this, or an unpopular opinion, but almost seems like we've taken the idea of blockchains, and because they're open and permissionless and decentralized and stuff, we are almost arbitrarily deciding that the social structures around that for governance should be the same. Like, we need to make it as decentralized as possible. We need to have open organizations and stuff so everyone can contribute, everyone can has equal footing on decisions and stuff. Is that just because we just think that that's the ideal that we should strive for, regardless of whether or not it's the best thing to actually do? Or should we just have centralized teams that just rapidly deploy, efficient, good, solid code that can last forever, and then it's deployed, done, and then they can step away? You no longer need to have an organization around that, which I think is an interesting question as well.
I think it's a spectrum.
Absolutely.
I think that I absolutely agree with you. I think certain things like pseudo swap, like I said, they don't need governance. Leave them alone. They work so well. Just leave them to do their thing. Don't need it. However, some things do. Ethereum, for example, it's a blockchain, but definitely needs the guidance, the constant development, and that has to have a governance structure. Things like young protocols would need one technically, depending on their job. So Tokamak, for example, I think it was discussed before, but you're not going to just whack in autonomous kind of reactors, like permissionless reactors. I know they changed the name, but that's like would be a terrible idea, right? Not a good idea. So it needs to be guided by people who are competent. Of course, as that gets mature, maybe that will become autonomous. Fantastic, right? Done. Don't touch it. But then it's matured beyond a point, and there'll be other building blocks being built on this kind of platform, which is tokamak, right? I'm just using it as an example. And I think that's very important, and that does need a governance structure. These flat governance structures, for example, probably aren't best for that sort of scenario, which is what's on our mind. And it's a question of, if you have a structure developed off, you can have team leaders, one or multiple team leaders to a group, and then you could have sections below them of groups of individuals who are specialized, including the people like the leaders. They're specialized in their sphere of competence, and they operate very well in that. They can assess situations, they can go look at new opportunities, they can discuss, criticize, etc. And then they can converse with the other teams, and as a whole, they can vote. That's really good in small groups. We talked about this last captain's call. I think you were out having a lovely hike.
I was.
Frolicking in nature.
I was frolicking.
Some of us were in a dark room in a cupboard talking about governance, which is sad. But I touched on this thing called Dunbar's number. And basically, its thing is that small groups can only be so effective. Once you go over a certain number, they become flat, or they become less and less and less effective. So there's critical mass for certain structures. So you kind of best to stay within that. It's also great for vetting people, taking people who are participating, having incentives that are sustainable, which are needed. Again, it's a pillar of governance, incentives. And so all these things go into a mixing pot, and you've got to get the balance right. The other thing you touched on as well was, how not all of these protocols or projects need governance. I think that is true. I think a lot of them are trying to do this thing that I touched on in the article called capital. Oh no, it's like governance extracted value, I think is what I called it. And it has been banded around before, so it's not me who's coined that. But some of them don't need it, and they're using it to extract value from the protocol to themselves, or the big money who comes in is using it to extract value and gain profit at the cost of the protocol, which is not right, I don't believe. So that brings into the case of mercenary capital and liquidity locusts, who basically come in, they farm the yield, they dipset, or they will come in, they will buy votes, and then vote for their own means at the detriment of the protocol and the other investors, and then again, pop smoke, they're out, see you later. And they're vampires. And they bounce from one protocol to the next. If you just use governance for no reason, you open yourself to these exposures, and people pay for it. I will say those structures can be based off different things. I think I bounded around the time of the call, I bounded meritocracies, or a meritocratic system where you kind of draw the talent in, or have the participants kind of picked through a system that prizes participation or social value, or different metrics, whatever metrics you want to put on it. And I think that's very important as well. That's what they do in the real world.
It is, yeah. And I quite like that structure of, and again, it's similar to a standard corporate structure where you have say like a board of directors, and then departments with department heads, and then teams under them. Of course, with the kind of DAO spin on it, where you're a lot more open. Like there's no crazy long 3-month hiring process, right? You just bubble up participants who have been responsive, who've been productive and stuff, and allow them to do the work they are good at within those individual teams. But I do quite like the idea of having like a governance team, a legal team, a development team, a biz dev team, et cetera, and allowing people to kind of come in and out of those different teams, while each one of those teams perhaps is governed or led by one or many kind of subject matter experts, let's call them, to kind of manage. Because you do kind of need someone to act as like a team lead, a scrum leader, a project manager, or whatever it may be, whatever the term you want to use. For Tokamak, I like the idea of calling them like marshals as like the leaders, and then each managing like squadrons below them, very similar to like councils or like Y teams within Yearn. And that lends itself, I think, very well to efficiency, while also having a reasonable degree of decentralization, because you can have these token holders delegate to team leaders or these other subject matter experts, because they're obviously the most qualified to kind of know what they're speaking to. Rook has the same concept as this. They call them Sophons, which are basically, again, subject matter experts that you can kind of depend on to do the reading, to do the due diligence required to know that they are educated in the topic that whatever they're going to decide on for governance proposals. Because in a standard democracy, like you can't necessarily depend on every single eligible voter to do the due diligence required to make educated decisions. You do, I mean, delegation in a like representative democracy is something you want to do. You find the person who, through just their conversations on Discord, through their interviews on podcasts, whatever it may be, that you feel align with your own values, and then you delegate to them and allow them to do the hard work of like actually like staying up to date on what's happening. So that's a system I think is efficient, reasonably decentralized, and lends itself to moving quickly while not being completely bogged down in the actual process. Then also that kind of leads into another line of thought that is the complete opposite. So devil's advocate to my devil's advocate. What if we're focusing too much on efficiency? Like what if we don't need to act quickly in the same way that a Postgres or MySQL database is vastly faster, more efficient, has more processing power than Ethereum or any other blockchain? Why do we bother with blockchains, right? Like, is it just because we are nerds and want something to tinker with and want, have some fun little thing in our lab running? Or is it because we actually value the decentralization above the efficiency? Why isn't that line of thinking translated directly to the governance part? Why are we talking so much about making things as efficient as possible? Is it worth the trade-off to just have these very inefficient systems for governance in the same way that we have them for, let's say, the distributed database technology? Maybe we should just deal with having slow governance and having decisions be kind of drag on and have to, be shaped over months and months and months, or perhaps years, in order to affect change. Because that's how real governments work, right? We vote once every 2 years, every 4 years, and it's a very slow, arduous process. But that's the trade-off you make in order to have a proper, open kind of governance system and democracy. Or is that never going to work because, let's say capitalism, and that if you don't move quick enough, someone else will beat you, right? If you don't deploy your contracts fast enough to have the best product, then someone else, across the WeWork is going to do it before you. So is it maybe a not a race to the bottom, but maybe that's the best term for it? Is it just you'll always have to sacrifice some level of decentralization just because there's competition?
Well, there's three things that I think of when you could have mentioning the devil's advocate and then the devil's advocate.
Just it's devils all the way down.
It's devils. Well, I mean, we're all terrible people, but so I would say people have a tendency, and this is just my personal observation, to denigrate hierarchies and organizations that have been around for a long time just because they want to come up with something new, or they think that those hierarchies and organizations are evil, which they might be. But they're made up of people, and to be honest, we're no better than everyone else. I don't think so. Definitely, I'm not. So I would say hierarchies are really good, and that's why they've stuck around for so long. They prize specialization, they prize efficiency. They're very good at what they do. I think that shouldn't be something that people just throw to the curb. Even within MakerDAO, there is a hierarchy. Maybe not the apparent sense, but there is most definitely a social hierarchy. There is definitely a capital hierarchy. You cannot avoid them. It's just they're there. They're like a symptom. They're not a cause, in a sense, or an effect, not a cause, I should say. I'm going to go sciencey about it. The other thing you touched on was fast versus slow. We can take this from a number of different angles. I read a book called Slow Thinking versus Fast Thinking recently, which is very good. I think that won't be the best example, but I think Warren Buffett might be a good example. Stays in the theme of DeFi, right? And in his earlier years, he took quick moves and a little bit more risky positions. As he got older and moved to like Berkshire Hathaway and things like that, and they had more and more assets under control, or assets under management, AUM, depends on how TradFi you want to get, they became less and less risky and more slow. Another way you can look at this is city-states, and you could look at dictators, very, very quick moving, but a point of failure. Then, dictator dies, things fall apart. However, and also really not very coercion resistant, easy to manipulate. Okay, you could look at democracies, which is sort of what kind of blockchain is more based on. It's more egalitarian, more democratic, more widespread and decentralized, less coercion resistant. Which is again, like saying, how much do you care about that? Because there are other blockchains. But I think it is something to be prized. And I think as something becomes more decentralized and good at what it does, it should become harder to manipulate, but also slower moving. So I think I don't think there's one optimal solution. Again, it's a sliding scale. But I do agree, as in, how do you quantify or figure out what sort of properties that protocol, blockchain, project needs? So a question to be answered. I am unsure of the answer.
Well, maybe the answer will reveal itself, right? This is all very Darwinian. You say, there are other blockchains. If blockchains are slow and cumbersome and not very efficient, then why is Ethereum still arguably the most used blockchain compared to something more centralized like Solana or Binance Smart Chain? Is it why are the users opting for the slower option versus the faster centralized option? So over time, all this will sort itself out, really, because protocols, blockchains, L1s, L2s, decentralized applications, teams, or every different cog in the machine will be stress test to the maximum. Nation states, governments, competition, whatever it may be, any sort of malicious actors, like the weak will be destroyed and the strong will survive. So you'll have protocols that have, let's say, vulnerable to coercion centralized hierarchies, perhaps be overtaken and run to the ground, because eventually with any sort of, especially in crypto where everything is very profit and profit motivated, anything that can be taken advantage of will be. So you'll have certain actors that may be familiar on CT that go in and raid treasuries, perhaps protocols that are trading under risk-free value. He'll go in and then, like a locust, eat it from inside out and leave a husk behind. So will decentralization come out on top just by default, because all other more vulnerable designs just eventually be destroyed by all sorts of different pressures externally?
Yeah, I think there's something called the Lindy effect, if
Yes.
you've heard of it before. And Lindy effect is the larger something is and the longer it's been around, the harder it is to kill. Ethereum and Bitcoin have been around for a while. They're hard to kill. Now, there is a larger conversation to be had around that, I'm aware. But I think the decentralization and the fact that there are less points of single points of failure in Ethereum, for example, makes it so much more resilient compared to other centralized chains. And I think that's one of the things that people really prize. They also prize liquidity and value and people actively building, etc., etc. But I think that is one of the reasons that people prize it so much. It doesn't go down. It is reliable. It has been shown to be coercion resistant. It has been shown to resist collusion as well in some cases. In its early days, some people were pushing proposed changes in the mining and things like that, and how I forget the EIP number, but it was actively pushed back against the community. They tried to push it again, and they tried to push it again, and it just got to the point where they realized that it was not going nowhere. And it just got rejected and never came back up again. And that was a point where it was a kind of, I think it was a focal point at which Ethereum kind of had that level of decentralization, had that level of resistance. And then it kind of took off from there. And I think over time it's just become bigger and stronger, multiple testnet layers, so many people that operate on it. I think those things are important, personally. But you are right, though. So I think that things will be stress tested. I mean, everything's being stress tested now. Where there's smoke, there's fire. We saw that with 3 Arrows Capital. And then everyone who had exposure to them.
Yep. Voyager, Celsius, everyone that had any sort of,
and everyone who's not
there.
Talking about it still.
Yeah.
That's
a whole episode there.
That is an episode. I saw someone say on CT, they were like, if one person's talking about it, doesn't matter. If two people are talking about it, there might be something to be learned, or pay attention to that. If 3 people are saying the same things, that's probably a problem. It's like I forget what it's called. Is it Howe's test or Howard's test? I think it was about a duck, but people use it with zebras as well. And it's like, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And it's a question of, if a few big movers had exposure to large amounts of leverage, etc., and only 1 or 2 of them are coming out with it, there's more.
Yeah, and that is a good example of when these decentralized systems that are not coercion resistant are more resilient than their centralized counterparts, because Celsius, Voyager, etc., they're going to be locked up in ongoing like lawsuits and legal battles trying to determine who gets the payouts or whatever uh, funds are
Employees
left. Exactly.
and VCs.
Yep. But what
Yeah.
happened with Aave and other on-chain lending protocols? They were paid back immediately. Those were made whole because they had to be, because you can't.
Code is law.
Code is law. You can't manipulate on-chain activity, on-chain leverage. There's no backroom dealings with a smart contract, and that is powerful. And I know personally, I'm not like an ETH maxi, but I don't keep sizable amounts of funds on non-ETH L1 right now. I maybe trust some of them, but certainly after the Terra collapse, and after Solana going down multiple times and having funds locked and just you're unable to pay off your leverage or whatever it may, or make any sort of withdrawals, having that very reliably decentralized and like always up blockchain that you can depend on is the most important thing when you're dealing with your life savings, perhaps your money. Like, it's genuinely one of the most important things in the world to people is like their livelihood. And so where you keep your money, where you keep your funds is extremely important. And you don't want to keep it in a protocol that is subject to coercion or manipulation. And so again, going back to the Darwinism aspect of this, those protocols and L1s and apps and stuff that are resilient are the ones that people will end up using. And if and when blockchains and Ethereum do become the future of France and like the de facto rails for payments and financial infrastructure in the world, only the protocols that are completely resilient and trustworthy are going to be used, because people just won't rely on other things. For perhaps, there's always going to be apps coming up online that are more like casino-y. People can just get in, get out, gamble and stuff like that. But when you're talking about like actual like Visa type payment rails, you only want the stuff that is not gonna you're not gonna rug you. And so yeah, I think regardless of how the protocols are built on the DAO side, it doesn't matter if the team is centralized or decentralized or how open they are or whatever. Eventually, when that protocol, like you say, it's a spectrum. So you start out centralized, and then once the protocol matures and ossifies, then you can kind of separate the team, the head, from the rest of the body, and just have something that's a permanent hyperstructure out there. And that's definitely where we're all moving to. So I think the idea of it being a spectrum where you start off, move fast and break things, slowly go towards more decentralized, more ossified and immutable. That's definitely seems to be the path forward of how all these things are going to go down. And there's no reason why new projects that pop up need to start off completely decentralized and stuff like that. Because again, you got to build the damn thing first, and you got to get shit done. You got to write the code. At the end of the day, like someone's typing into a keyboard,
And if you want to be a DAO or a DAC, I should say, that is proposing that they invest in XYZ, then yeah, you're going to be human centric. That's brilliant. Good for you. I don't think that you should hide behind that as a shield and be, I think I referred to them as pseudo DAOs. There's no need to be, ashamed of that. I don't think I call them pseudo DAOs, but technically you could just call yourself a DAC and you go, oh, you're not a pseudo DAO, you're a DAC. Like, of course you've got a hierarchy and a centralized governance system, centralized in a sense. Anyway, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that you're right in saying that as you trend towards a mature code that is ideally bugless and is immutable, the solid payment rails and things like that should be exactly that. They need to be reliable. They need to be tested, and really not liable to be breaking or manipulated. I think that's one of the most important things. Um, I think that one of the things that is missing is the accountability and responsibility that comes with governance. Um, and I think that that is something that needs to be solved. You can bake that into governance protocols, and it's not something that is really done at the moment. I'm writing something on at the moment. You've not seen it yet. You will soon. But I think that's very, very important. In TradFi, you have laws, you have regulations, you have people to hold you accountable. In DeFi, in crypto, there is none of that really. You can, in some cases, be held in a court of law outside. Reference to, I don't know, Zach's, one of Zach's exposures, for example. People do sometimes get caught, or at least have their wallets blacklisted, of, things like that. There are attempts at this, like Aragon's court, and they're trying to do this sort of thing. It's not really getting traction, and it's not widely used at the moment. And I think that's something that should be explored. Contracts that are, written or baked into a smart contract between two protocols, DAO to DAO, something like that, or whatever, could be a good step to do. Stops people from reverting on their agreements, things like that. Good idea. But really, I think that people should be looking to bake this into their protocols, into their governance. I think that's very, very important. Something to be considered. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, we're building for like 5, 10 plus years down the road. I believe that people complaining about DeFi protocols being hacked, the issue, like the growing pains associated with pretty much anything crypto and DeFi related, just it's you got to give it time. I think it's unrealistic to expect all this stuff to be built and at a good ending point within the span of a couple of years. I think a lot of the complaints that we see and a lot of these questions that are unanswered are going to resolve themselves over time. I bring this up because I've seen a lot of tweet threads lately saying how DAOs have failed, how like DAOs are just not a good structure, and that like they were a bad idea from the beginning, and they're just not working out, and they're a failure. And I completely disagree. I think we just need to find where along the spectrum is more ideal, and then be open to the idea that it is a spectrum and that there's no one solution for any of this. There's no one concrete answer saying this is how your DAO should be structured and this is what works. It's a sliding scale, and over the next few years, more of this stuff will be figured out. More protocols will figure out their ideal operating structure, and will continue to build more efficiently. And it's just it's going to work itself out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, things are always stress tested. I think people need to realize that if you're investing into a very young protocol, you've not done your due diligence or vetted the team and things like that, there are huge risks associated with that.
Wow.
If you're operating based off code in a place that has no regulation, like we were saying before, no accountability or responsibility processes or organizations, external organizations, should something fail internally, there are risks. There are many points of failure along that road. In terms of people saying that DAOs have failed, I would say that those people need to go and read more about DAOs.
Yeah.
A DAO is not a DAO, like we've just discussed. There's this whole spectrum. You can break them down into, autonomous agents. You can break them down into, decentralized autonomous corporations. You can, there's loads of ways to cut this up. So a DAO is not a DAO. A DAO is the ideal. That's how I see it. And so saying that they failed, frankly, is silly. Ethereum is essentially got a DAO tied to it. Maker's got a DAO tied to it. I would say they're far from failures. Yes, they have some problems here and there. What doesn't? But they work very well. Could they be more efficient? In some cases, yes. Could those efficiencies bring points of failure? Almost definitely. There are trade-offs. So yeah, I would say that. I mean, I'm always agreeing because it's there's a good points. I would say, look, in my mind, when I look at these things, I look for teams. Are they reliable? What have they made before? What structures are in process? So what are they building? What's the functionality? How are they proposing to go about achieving their goals or their objectives? How does it fit into the bigger scale? How does it fit into your kind of strategy? And I plan accordingly. I mean, there's lots of considerations to be made, but I think that in a longer kind of time window, if you are looking 5 years, which is not that long, a lifetime in crypto, in TradFi, not even short term.
Not at all.
Short term in TradFi is kind of like 10 years and below.
Yeah.
So really, if you're looking 10 years down the road, where was Bitcoin 10 years down the road? Things move on exponentially. Metcalfe's law is exponential in nature. Look at where we were 30 years ago with the old Betamax and VHS. Things move at a staggering pace, and they don't move linearly. And technology has kind of been the boon to that. So I would say really perspective is needed. That's what I think of when I get a little bit panicky on the downtrends. I go, ooh, yes, you could make some fast moves, preserve capital, buy in at a lower level, etc., etc. But on a long kind of time frame, if you're in the right pots, if you are investing in the right things, the chances of you having a good position are higher than zero.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. But yeah, but I mean, there's not many of us here. There's even less now.
Yeah, and that's a big part of it too. Is I think all these criticisms that I've seen just popped up when the markets crashed, right? Like no one was complaining when the prices were up. People were having a great time. No one was complaining about the teams. Discords were just like happy-go-lucky, everything. Price goes down, sentiment changes. Like,
oh my God.
Whoever said there's nothing like price to change sentiment. But
exactly.
Yeah, but then you see these people complaining, people on the outside, let's say, complaining, saying, oh, DAOs don't work, oh, they're a failure. And what is their frame of reference for that? Like, what are they looking at? How are they judging that? They're looking at, CoinGecko. They're not like going into Discords, listening in on community calls. I mean, listening in on the state of the reactor for Tokamak, listening to the governance calls for Rook, all these sorts of things. They're having, they're doing so much. They have not slowed down. If anything, they've sped up because there's less noise in the background. There's less moon boys shouting. There's less kind of frenzy to worry about. Now is when all the best projects are going to be built.
Absolutely.
And so now is also the time to join DAOs and do your part. I probably said it on the other episodes, but my biggest regrets of crypto are not being unable to sell the top and buy back the Pico bottom. It's been losing interest during the bear markets. And in the years past, I would say it was a little bit more understandable to lose interest because at the end of like the 2017 cycle, nothing that was really built then had much actual use case. DAOs weren't as much of a thing. there's and people did genuinely like leave and stop building. But then towards like the 2019 and certainly right now, this bear market is a bear market for price. It is not a bear market for builders. Like more building than ever is happening right now. And so yeah, now is a good time to find projects that you like and contribute, because
Yeah.
there's nothing else like it in the world. There's no way you can just pop into Facebook's or YouTube or Netflix's corporate Slack channels and just start like saying, "Oh, hey, I built this dashboard. You guys want to start funding me for XYZ, or can I start recording the community calls and summarizing them, or whatever it may be?" You can't do that in TradFi and in fintech outside of crypto. There's you'd be laughed at. But here you
Yeah.
can. You can participate in whatever interests you, and there's protocols building everything from lending to market making to NFT AMMs, whatever it may be, and they all need help. There is a shortage of productive community members and developers, and yeah, now is a great time to take part and stay hooked on this industry, because obviously it's sticking around.
Yeah. I'd say you're far kinder than I am. When I hear people complaining and things like that, I mean, if you stick around, you see more of it than you want to, and it's forever there. I've heard the builders market thing banded around. That's, I mean, just kind of like the phrase that they put out, which kind of echoes what you've just said. I think you're right. I would say that the activity levels do tend to drop, but the teams work, and the difference is that the right teams who were clever or lucky have war chests and runways to carry on building. That was not what it was like before. People aren't leaving now. They're not going. The big projects, the ones who are smart, they're sticking around. Yeah. It's not the same. The open nature you talked about is absolutely right. You can't do that anywhere else. And you might be really good at what you do. You might have taught yourself all of this stuff from online or through books. You may be better than most people in those jobs, but the barriers to entry will not let you go through. If you can prove yourself in these environments, it's almost meritocratic, like we said before. People realize your work and they go, let's take this person on board. There's nowhere else you could do that. It's ridiculous. And the people who complain, there's that phrase that narrative follows price, which I've heard people band around recently as well. I kind of tend to agree-ish, as long as it actually happens like that. But like you say, you can pop into the Discords or Telegrams in some cases of some of these protocols and projects. Hell, you can go into Ethereum's Discord and listen in and watch the developers talk here and there. You will get an idea of what's happening with the merge.
Yeah.
You just
September 19th.
No permission. September. So they say. Yeah, we'll see. And the other thing I would say is that the people who are complaining often don't really have the competence to back it up.
Right.
They're like just people who spectate and then complain. And I
hate that. Is
I'm a fairly
the most
well-tempered
annoying
person,
thing to me.
God,
people who sit on the sidelines and just
watching
throw
that.
rocks.
Yeah,
like,
you're like,
you know what? Do your if you complain if you were deep inside of it. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
Andre's kind of farewell letter complaining about crypto was an example of someone on the inside. Yeah, farewell.
He's gone nowhere.
Yeah, he's somewhere. Maybe he's a 12-year-old with a credit card. Or
fully
else,
still active on chain.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's people complaining from the outside, far less complaining from the inside. And I would say that the bear market, in addition to filtering out the people who are only in it for profit and filtering out the builders who are only trying to build things to scam others, those projects gets washed out, which is a net good. It's like a meteorite hit DeFi, and the week all got washed away. At the same time, on the code level, the same thing happened. Some protocols were only designed with bull markets in mind. Their kind of uh, reflexive loops only worked when things were up only, cough Terra, and when things were going down, they also got washed out, and that's a benefit, right? Like the bear markets are a good way to cleanse, right? It's a complete hand washing, it's a cleanse of the
Mm.
ecosystem. And so if you were sitting on the sidelines wondering, oh, which projects are worthwhile? How do I know I'm going to spend, commit my time, my effort to learning and to building for a project if it's not going to be around long term? Well, now's a good opportunity to see which projects have stuck around, which ones are still
Yeah.
building, because now is a great time to identify those. And place your bets both with your own personal time commitment and with your own funds. But
Yeah.
yeah, now's the ideal
Yeah. I
time, and
mean,
it may seem like a bit cheeky to say, but it really is.
it is. I think you need to ask yourself that: do you want to be early, or do you want to survive? You
Yeah,
know, it's a question of some of these things that have been around. Yeah, sure, you may not be made a millionaire overnight, but they're probably not going to go anywhere, and they're probably good at what they do, and they're probably something that's good to invest in or invest your time in, money or otherwise. Um, and I think that a lot of people fade that. But if you aim with that in mind, you'll do really well. Um, in terms of participation, like times like now, if you think there's a problem and you're just complaining, I think that some people should ask themselves, what can I learn? What can I educate myself on? Do I need to read a book? Do I need to read proposals, IPs, all of this? Um, and then what can I do to try and fix it? Can I offer value? Can I write things? Can I code? Can I do X, Y, Z? Can I make a Dune dashboard? If you can, maybe you should go and do it. Maybe it'll help them. Maybe you've invested in that project and you have vested interests.
yep.
Maybe you should think about that. You've got some spare time on your hands, use it. But that's easier said than done. That's my perspective. Um, but I think it's the ideal market for it. It's washed out a lot of the bad blood, if you could call them that. We've seen the vulnerabilities of CFI lenders, which they were there before. Like the vulnerabilities were there before,
Mm-hmm.
and there were like warning signs. You know, if you know how things work, like for instance, Binance, when you stake your tokens on Binance, the reason they're giving you like incentives to do it is because they can use that to extract value. How they go about that is not your choice. They may take leverage, they may trade or short the protocols that you've got those tokens, like those tokens off. So you need to really be aware of it. Um, Teaching yourself that now may change your opinions of what you're willing to work in or put your money into. It's a good time for it.
It is.
You know,
And
yeah,
I've been here for a long time. I've seen many cycles, but this cycle I've learned more than all the other ones combined. Um, there's been a lot more insight, especially with the kind of collapse of the global markets. There's been a lot more exposure of like, what is all this stuff really built on? How are all the world's economies, geopolitically interconnected and stuff? And crypto has so many parallels to that. The dollar goes up compared to the euro, while everything is really actually going down because inflation is running rampant across the world. That has similarities to kind of the reflexive nature of crypto protocols and stuff. So you have the best industry to learn from in from a financial perspective, from a corporate structure perspective, from a builder's perspective. Um, and since we know now that this stuff isn't going away, if you're young and you want to kind of shape your future and your career, uh, now is the best time to kind of flex those muscles and learn and tap into projects that interest you, and just do your part, and help build and learn and better yourself and set yourself up really well, both personally from educating yourself and learning about everything there is to know about all these different aspects of corporate structure and finance and
For sure.
development stuff. And then, if you're lucky, or if you're smart, you'll also set yourself up well financially, because the most gains are made while people accumulate value during periods like this.
Yeah, I think you're right. Learn about it. The same functions that happen in TradFi happen within crypto. That, it's built by people from there. It's just trying to solve some of the inherent problems. So it's slightly different, but the same rules do apply, give or take. It's also a hedge against TradFi in a sense. So there is that too. It's borderless.
Yeah, and I would read some Arthur blogs if you want to kind
Yeah.
of get a sense on what the doomsday scenario is for like a
sure.
kind of TradFi global political kind of connected collapse looks like,
read
and how
Arthur
that
Hayes.
benefits crypto.
Yeah, if you want to be really depressed, read Arthur Hayes, and then read Charles Bukowski afterwards for dessert. Or you could go and listen to or read Ray Dalio's books, and he'll like Changing of the World Order.
There's
It's
a really good
fantastic,
YouTube video on that, about maybe like 20 minutes long.
Yeah.
That's a very good
Yeah.
listen. I'll link that in the
It sums up the
description.
book, and then it says you can go and read the book. It's got more detail. But he sums up the cycles of these things, and they've repeated themselves, and they're not going to just stop. They live a life cycle just like humans. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing everything trend downwards and the dollar maybe up somewhat at the moment, because it is the global reserve. So there's lots of different things like that I think people should know. It doesn't get taught in schools. It's almost like a barrier for those who are involved in TradFi to like keep the power within themselves. I always think of stuff like that. It's like all the lawyers, they have to pass the bar. It's like that's a monopoly, bro. It is. And they read contracts, and it's written in a different language that other people can't understand, and it's not taught. Those are barriers. Those are intentional. That's a feature, not a bug.
It is. And like I mentioned, being in crypto has really made these things much less opaque to me. You really get a glimpse behind the door of what makes these things run. And the major takeaway from that Ray Dalio book and video, The Changing World Order, is the rise and fall of empires. And the visual is like Rome going up and down, and then maybe what was next, I don't even know, but like the British Empire up and down, America up and down after World War II, kind of transferred that power. And then perhaps America is now reached the apex and is on its way down, maybe with China coming in next, maybe with crypto coming in next. Maybe the next world order financially is not a government, a traditional government. Perhaps it's crypto and a global nation, a digital nation state. Maybe it's a good plug for the new Balazs book. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. The Network State, where you have a internet-based economy, and that will be the next world order. And maybe that's a good place to end it. I think that we're going to see a lot of change in the next 10 years. And I think a lot of what crypto introduces is a casino. I think a lot of it, but underneath the scene of, underneath that casino is really what could be the next world order. And maybe that's a little bit optimistic, or pushes it a little bit too hard. But again, I would just say, like, dig deep into these DAOs and do your part to participate, and you can really see truly what's being built. And it's not just meme coins. It's these hyperstructures that can really power the next phase of the world's economy. And I truly believe that. And I think in the next, but it won't happen overnight, right? It's 10, 15, 20 years maybe. But I think we'll slowly see these systems taking over the traditional systems. And if you're a developer and you know how shaky the duct tape and toothpicks are that hold up the current world's financial system, you'll realize that like it's long overdue for a change, and there is no viable solution other than crypto. Nothing is out there that is as resilient or trustworthy or as decentralized and corruption resistant than crypto. So why not
Yeah.
crypto? So perhaps
Yeah,
that is the next world order.
As you say, change is painful, and out of chaos comes order.
Yep.
But we have to descend into chaos first. So
We absolutely do. Yeah.
on that note,
Thank you very much for your
this is
time.
not
Ouija.
financial advice.
Yeah, not financial
episode.
advice. Yeah, perhaps it will be China or another major world order, and crypto will seek to the nethers once again and never emerge. But if you're a true believer, yeah, keep toiling away, keep developing, keep building.
Join us in the long grass.
Yep, and we'll see you next episode. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.